The galactic court of Zeltrax was a monument to power and tradition, its towering obsidian spires stretching toward the endless night of space. Inside, the grand hall pulsed with the murmurs of dignitaries, warriors, and emissaries from countless star systems, all gathered for what had been promised to be a spectacle of humiliation. At the heart of it all, standing upon his elevated throne, was King Theros, ruler of the Zeltrax dominion, his presence alone commanding the attention of all. His eyes, dark as the void itself, gleamed with amusement as he gazed down at the humans standing defiantly before him. Captain Eric Stryker, the soldier who had survived battlefields where no man should have walked away, stood amidst the jeering crowd without so much as a flicker of uncertainty in his blue-gray eyes. He was an anomaly in this place, a human among giants, a lone soldier surrounded by warriors bred for conquest. Theros let out a sharp laugh, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "You amuse me, Terran. Do you truly believe you can stand against one of my blood? That you, a mere human, could match a Zeltraxi warrior?" Eric met the alien king's gaze without flinching. "I believe skill isn't dictated by birthright," he said, his voice steady. "You wanted a fight, so here I am." The gathered audience roared with laughter, their deep voices shaking the very walls. The idea that a human, a species they saw as fragile and inferior, could stand against a warrior of Zeltrax blood was beyond absurd. It was insulting. King Theros smirked, leaning forward. "Very well then, since you insist on this farce, I shall make it interesting." He lifted a single hand and from behind the throne she emerged. The chamber fell silent. Princess Vieira of Zeltrax strode into the center of the hall, her golden armor catching the light, her movements precise, deadly. She was taller than Eric, her physique sculpted by years of war, her presence enough to strike fear into the most seasoned of warriors. Where Theros commanded authority through his rule, Vieira commanded it through force. She halted beside her father, her piercing amber eyes settling on Eric with the gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. "You will fight her," Theros declared, his smirk widening. "My daughter, my strongest warrior. If you survive, perhaps your species deserves more credit than I have given it." The chamber erupted with approval, cheers and taunts alike filling the air. Vieira stepped forward, her expression unreadable, but there was something dangerous in the way she moved. "Do you know what happens to those who face me in combat, human?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged with something cold. Eric tilted his head slightly, the corner of his lips twitching. "I'm guessing they don't go home with souvenirs." A flicker of amusement crossed her features, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You won't survive," she said simply. Eric exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "I'll take my chances." King Theros's laughter boomed once more. "Then so be it." He gestured grandly, sealing the fate of both warriors. "Tomorrow at dawn, you shall face my daughter in the arena of kings. And when she breaks you, the galaxy will see just how weak your kind truly is." The crowd cheered wildly, already anticipating the human's inevitable defeat. Eric remained still, his gaze locked on Vieira. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She only stared, measuring him, calculating. And though no words were spoken, a silent understanding passed between them. This was not just a duel, it was something else entirely. The air inside the warriors' barracks was heavy with the scent of iron and battle-worn leather, the dim light casting long shadows against the walls. Eric sat on the edge of a reinforced training bench, methodically checking his weapons, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Despite the roaring spectacle promised for the next day, his mind was calm. He had fought wars. He had bled and survived where others had fallen. And now he would face something completely different. "You're insane." The voice came from behind him, dry and edged with disbelief. Turning slightly, Eric met the incredulous gaze of Commander Harlan, one of the few human officers permitted inside the galactic court, as part of the fragile diplomatic relations between Earth and Zeltrax. "You do realize what you've signed up for, right?" Harlan continued, pacing as he ran a hand over his short-cropped hair. "Vieira isn't just some royal with a sword. She's the best fighter in the entire Dominion. She's been training since she could walk. She's never been beaten, and yet," Eric interrupted, his voice even, "she's still just a person." Harlan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That person has disemboweled challengers twice your size, Carter. You're walking into a death sentence. Eric smirked slightly. I've been in worse. Harlan gave him a long, exasperated look before sighing. Fine. Since you're determined to get yourself killed, at least tell me you have a plan. Eric set down his blade, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I studied the holovids of her past duels, he admitted. She fights fast and aggressively, but it's more than just brute strength. She uses her opponent's reactions against them, sets traps mid-fight, forces them into thinking they have control, and then exploits the smallest mistake. Harlan crossed his arms. So you figured out how she fights. That doesn't mean you can win. Eric's smirk faded, his expression growing serious. No, but it means I know how to fight smart. Silence stretched between them before Harlan finally sighed. You know, if you do somehow pull this off, Theros is going to lose his mind. And knowing their customs, he hesitated. Eric glanced up. What? Harlan rubbed his forehead, muttering under his breath before finally speaking. You know the binding law, right? Eric frowned. What law? Harlan exhaled, looking like he was about to deliver a death sentence. If you defeat Vieira, by Zeltraxi tradition, she is bound to you. As in, she becomes yours, completely. Eric's stomach tightened. For the first time, the true stakes of this fight sank in. This wasn't just a duel for survival. It was a challenge with consequences far beyond the arena. And as he leaned back against the cold metal bench, his mind already racing with the possibilities, he realized one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what happened tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same again. The Arena of Kings was more than just a battleground. It was a legacy of blood and conquest. A sacred ground where the strongest warriors in the galaxy had risen and fallen for centuries. The structure itself loomed over the capital of the Zeltrax dominion, like a monument to the very concept of battle. Its massive stone walls carved with the names of those who had triumphed and those who had perished. As Eric stepped into the massive Colosseum, the sheer scale of it staggered him. Tens of thousands of Zeltraxi warriors and noble houses filled the stands, their voices rising into a deafening roar of anticipation. This wasn't just an execution, this was a spectacle. A lesson to any species foolish enough to believe they could stand against the might of the Dominion. He could feel their eyes on him, their sneers, their mocking glances. In their minds, he had already lost. He had heard their words whispered through the corridors before the match. The human doesn't stand a chance. He'll be dead before the first minute. He is an insult to the arena. But they were wrong. Eric had fought wars on planets where the very air could kill a man. He had taken down enemies who towered over him, who had more limbs, more weapons, more advantages. He knew exactly what it meant to be underestimated, and he had never lost because of it. Across the arena, the opposite gates slammed open, and she emerged, Princess Vieira of Zeltrax. The moment she stepped forward, the entire crowd fell silent. She was the living embodiment of their warrior code, her reputation flawless, unshaken, undeniable. Her golden armor gleamed under the harsh artificial light, a perfect complement to the fire in her amber eyes. Every inch of her radiated danger, from the way she carried herself to the sheer weight of the greatsword strapped across her back, a weapon that had ended the lives of champions far stronger than him. She stopped only a few feet away, her piercing gaze locking onto his. You still have time to reconsider, she said, her voice cool, controlled. Eric smirked, adjusting the grip on his combat knife. What, and disappoint the crowd? Her lips curled into something that almost resembled amusement. Almost. Bravery is admirable, foolishness is not. Then let's see which one I am. The war drums sounded, reverberating through the arena like the heartbeat of a god. The energy fields surrounding the battleground flared to life, ensuring that neither of them could run nor be interrupted. There would be no escape, no mercy, no turning back. And then, Vieira moved. She was on him in an instant, closing the distance faster than anyone her size had the right to. The ground shook beneath her steps as she brought her massive blade around in a devastating arc, the sheer force of it, capable of cleaving a man in two. But Eric was already moving. He dropped low, rolling beneath the swing, feeling the air split apart just above him as the weapon whistled past his head. Before she could recover, he sprang forward, slashing toward the exposed part of her side. only to be met by a gauntleted fist to his ribs. The impact exploded through his body, the sheer force sending him skidding backward across the sand. He barely had time to regain his footing before she was on him again. No hesitation, no wasted movement. This wasn't just a fight. This was a hunt, and he was the prey. Eric's ribs ached with every breath, but he had no time to dwell on the pain. Vieira came at him again, her great sword slicing through the air like a blade of pure wrath, each swing faster and sharper than the last. He had known she was strong, but seeing it on a holovid and experiencing it firsthand were two entirely different things. Every movement was calculated, ruthless, an onslaught designed to push him into a corner where she could end him in a single decisive strike. He couldn't let that happen. Eric ducked and weaved, forcing her to keep chasing him, making her exert energy while he used as little as possible. He knew that no matter how strong someone was, fatigue always came eventually. But Vieira was relentless. She switched her stance mid-strike, suddenly reversing the momentum of her blade in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The tip of her sword grazed his shoulder, tearing through the armor plating and leaving a searing gash of pain across his skin. Eric clenched his jaw, shoving the pain away. Pain was nothing new. Pain wouldn't kill him. But one good hit from that sword would. He needed to change the game. With his next dodge, he deliberately let her blade come closer than before, baiting her into overextending. She took it. For the first time, she committed too hard, and in that single instant, Eric struck. He twisted past her blade, his smaller frame moving inside her guard before she could react. His knife slashed upward, not to kill, but to weaken, the serrated edge ripping through the straps of her armor, forcing her to drop her weapon or risk losing mobility. The moment it happened, the crowd gasped. Vieira staggered back, her sword slipping from her grasp, landing in the sand with a metallic thud. Silence fell over the Colosseum. Eric stood over her, his knife inches from her throat. His breathing was ragged, sweat running down his temple. Every muscle in his body burned, his ribs screaming, but he had won. For the first time in her entire life, Princess Vieira of Zeltrax had been defeated. She looked up at him, her amber eyes unreadable, her expression somewhere between disbelief and something else, something dangerous. Then slowly, she laughed. It was soft at first, a mere breath, but then it grew, rich and low, filled with something impossible to place. "You did it," she murmured. "You actually did it." Eric exhaled, his grip tightening on the hilt of his knife. "Guess that means I win." She smiled then, not in mockery, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous. "Yes," she said, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "You won." And at that moment, as the reality set in for both of them, Eric knew one undeniable truth. Winning this fight was only the beginning, because now she was his, and nothing would ever be the same again. The arena remained in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on the thousands of spectators like a suffocating force. No Zeltraxi warrior had ever lost in such a fashion. No human had ever left this battlefield victorious. And yet, before their very eyes, Eric's striker had done the impossible. Vieira still knelt in the sand, her great sword lying discarded beside her. Her golden armor was marred with cuts, the fastenings loosened where Eric's blade had torn through them. Sweat and dust clung to her skin, her breath slow but steady, and yet, she wasn't angry. She should have been furious, humiliated even. But as she lifted her gaze to meet his, her amber eyes burned with something far more dangerous than rage: curiosity. Eric remained poised, knife in hand, his stance solid but not threatening. He didn't press the blade to her throat, didn't demand her submission. He had already won, and they both knew it. The weight of his victory was undeniable. Then the silence shattered. A booming, thunderous voice echoed through the arena, filled with barely contained rage. "Unacceptable." King Theros rose from his throne, his dark crimson robes billowing as he stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The once roaring crowd now cowered, their celebratory fervor quickly dampened by the unmistakable fury radiating from their ruler. Eric turned his head slightly, his breathing still labored from the fight, but he held his ground as the king descended the steps of his platform, his towering form cutting through the silence like a blade. "My daughter," Theros said, his voice sharp and full of disdain, "has never lost a battle, not to our greatest champions. not to warlords who have spilled the blood of 1,000 worlds. His gaze snapped to Eric, eyes dark with barely restrained wrath. And yet, here she kneels, bested by a mere Terran soldier. Eric exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He could already feel where this was going. You made the challenge, he said, his voice level, unwavering, and she accepted. Tharos's jaw clenched. He was a king, a ruler who had spent decades solidifying his empire through unmatched strength and strategy. He had been certain, absolutely certain, that his daughter would crush this human, that his species would be humiliated in front of the entire Dominion. And yet, fate had other plans. The king's gaze flickered back to Vieira, who had yet to move, yet to deny what had happened. You know what this means, Tharos said, his tone sharp, expectant. By the laws of our people, a defeated warrior is bound to their victor, to live by their side, to serve them, to answer to them. His eyes darkened. Even if that victor is a human. Vieira finally rose to her feet. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, the weight of the ancient custom now looming over them all. It was an unbreakable law, one that had been honored for generations. Defeat meant submission. A warrior of Zeltrax did not simply walk away from loss. The daughter of the king was no exception. Tharos turned back to Eric, his expression unreadable but tainted with reluctance. As per our traditions, he said, each word forced, each syllable carrying the weight of his displeasure. Vieira is yours now, to do with as you see fit. The words settled over them all like a physical force. Eric's grip on his knife tightened, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. This had never been his goal. He had fought to prove a point, to walk away in one piece, not to own another person. But then, he looked at Vieira, and she did not flinch. She did not deny the law, did not fight against what had been decreed. She only watched him, her amber eyes unreadable. The decision was now his, and the weight of it threatened to break him more than the fight ever had. The corridors beneath the arena were dimly lit, the stone walls vibrating slightly from the continued murmurs of the crowd above. The battle had ended, but its consequences were just beginning. Eric walked beside Vieira, his mind still spinning, still trying to grasp what had just happened. She followed in silence, her steps controlled, unwavering. Even now, stripped of her armor and the trappings of royalty, she held herself with the same unbreakable presence that had made her a legend among her people. Finally, when they were alone, Eric exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "All right," he muttered, turning to her. "Let's get one thing straight." Vieira raised an eyebrow, arms crossed. "You wish to release me?" Eric hesitated. He had thought about it. Of course he had. He had never wanted to claim her as some sort of prize. He had fought because he had no other choice, because walking away from a challenge like that would have been an insult to both of them. But now, standing here watching her, he realized something. She wasn't asking for freedom. She wasn't even expecting it. "You really would just follow me?" he asked, his voice low. "Just because of some ancient rule?" Vieira tilted her head, studying him. "You misunderstand," she said. "This is not slavery. This is not a loss of identity or honor." She stepped closer, her presence unshakable. "This is a warrior's law," she continued. "To be bound to one who bests you in battle is not humiliation, it is an acknowledgement of worth. Among my people, there is no greater test of strength, no greater measure of a warrior's spirit, than to face defeat and choose to stand beside the one who proved themselves superior." Eric clenched his jaw. "You're saying you want this?" Vieira's amber eyes burned with something unreadable. "I am saying I do not regret it." Something in his chest tightened. This was not submission. This was acceptance. She had been undefeated, unchallenged, and now for the first time she had met someone who had pushed her beyond the edge of certainty, who had forced her to see what lay beyond invincibility. And instead of resenting it, she was embracing it. Eric exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't own you, Vieira." She smirked, tilting her head. "No, but I am yours." The words hit deeper than they should have, stirring something inside him he wasn't ready to name. Eric took a breath, staring at her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right then," he murmured. "Let's see what happens next." And from the look in Vieira's eyes, the spark of anticipation lurking just beneath the surface, he knew this was only the beginning. The The corridors of the royal citadel were colder than Eric expected, the walls lined with banners bearing the sigil of the Zeltrax dominion, the mark of conquest, of legacy, of power. He walked in measured steps beside Vieira, her presence beside him an undeniable force despite the tension that followed them like a shadow. She had not spoken much since the moment her father decreed her fate. She hadn't protested, hadn't questioned the binding law that made her his by the customs of her people. And yet, Eric could feel something simmering beneath the surface of her silence. Not anger, not resentment, but something else entirely. The throne room loomed ahead, its towering obsidian doors guarded by armored warriors who barely concealed their contempt for him. A human had defeated their strongest warrior, their royal bloodline, and now walked beside her as an equal. It was an insult to everything they had believed about strength, supremacy, and the natural order. Eric didn't care. What he cared about was what came next. King Theros sat on his massive throne, flanked by high-ranking warlords and nobles, each one a figure of influence within the dominion. He did not rise as they entered, did not acknowledge them beyond the slow, methodical drumming of his fingers against the armrest of his throne. "You should not be standing here, human," Theros said at last, his voice dangerously calm. "You should have been broken beneath my daughter's blade, and yet you live." Eric kept his stance firm, meeting the king's gaze without hesitation. "Because I fought for it." Tharos's nostrils flared slightly, his golden eyes darkening. "And now you believe you are owed something more?" Eric exhaled, keeping his tone measured. "I never asked for this. I fought because you made it clear I had no other choice, and I won." He glanced at Vieira briefly before turning back to the king. "You don't have to like it, but you will honor it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered nobles. The audacity of his words, the sheer defiance in them, sent a shockwave through the court. Tharos's fingers stilled against the throne's armrest. "You speak boldly for a man whose life still rests in my hands." "You made the rules," Eric countered, "and now you're bound by them, same as Vieira." At that, Tharos finally rose, his imposing form casting a long shadow over the room. "You think binding my daughter to you grants you safety?" His voice was low, cold, a slow-burning fury curling at the edges of each word. "It does not. You have made powerful enemies, Terran. There are those among my warlords who would rather spill your blood than accept what has been done here today." Eric's jaw tightened. "Then I guess we'll see if they're braver than I am." A dangerous silence filled the hall. Then, unexpectedly, laughter. Not from Tharos, but from Vieira. She shook her head slightly, an amused smirk playing at the edges of her lips. "He is not wrong, father," she said, her voice smooth and sure. "You decreed this, now we see where it leads." Tharos studied her carefully, his gaze searching, measuring. Then, slowly, he sat back down. "You walk a treacherous path, human," the king said at last, "but you have earned your place in this hall, for now." His gaze darkened. "Step carefully, or you will find that even the strongest warriors can fall." Eric nodded once, knowing full well that this wasn't over. This had only just begun. The journey back to the war barracks was silent, the weight of the confrontation lingering between them. When they finally reached the private chamber that had been set aside for Eric, a modest, reinforced structure built for warriors of rank, Vieira stepped inside without hesitation, as if she belonged there already. Eric shut the door behind them, exhaling slowly. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" Vieira turned to him, crossing her arms. "Seeing my father struggle to accept something he cannot change." She smirked. "Yes, I did." Eric shook his head with a tired chuckle, leaning back against the wall. "You didn't have to back me up in there." Her golden eyes sharpened. "You truly believe I would stand against you after what happened?" He studied her, something unspoken settling between them. "Tell me something then," Eric said, pushing away from the wall. "Why aren't you angry?" "Who says I am not?" Vieira countered. Eric raised an eyebrow. "You don't act like someone who just lost everything." At that, she laughed, a deep knowing sound. "Lost? Is that what you think this is?" She stepped forward, her presence as commanding as it had been in the arena. "I have trained my entire life to be the strongest, to be undefeated. And yet, here you stand, proving that even I can be surpassed." She exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "Do you have any idea what that means to someone like me?" Eric hesitated, searching for the right words. It means you have something new to fight for. Vieira's lips curled slightly. Exactly. A quiet beat passed between them. Then, without warning, she reached for her gauntlet, unclasping it and tossing it onto the table beside them. Her other hand followed, then the armor plating along her forearm, piece by piece, revealing the strong, scarred skin beneath. Eric frowned slightly. "What are you doing?" Vieira stepped closer, until she was standing just inches away. "In Zeltraxi tradition," she said softly, "a warrior who is bested in battle does not simply submit. They do not kneel. They do not become a slave." Her eyes held his, steady, unshaken. "They swear an oath, a bond that cannot be broken." Eric swallowed. "And what does that mean for you?" Vieira slowly extended her hand, palm up. "It means I stand with you." His chest tightened at the weight of those words. This wasn't forced obedience. This was a choice. Eric reached out, grasping her wrist firmly. The moment their hands met, the air shifted, something ancient and unspoken passing between them. A warrior's oath. Vieira smirked. "You do not yet understand what it means to have a warrior of my standing at your side." Eric exhaled, a slow grin forming. "Then I guess you'll have to show me." Vieira's golden eyes burned with something undeniable. "Oh, I intend to." And as the tension between them thickened, as the line between enemy and ally blurred into something far more dangerous, Eric knew. This was only the beginning. The war drums of Zeltrax echoed through the night, their deep, rhythmic pounding sending vibrations to the very bones of the city. The kingdom did not sleep. Not after the events of the day. Not after a human had done the impossible. Eric sat in the war barracks, his mind a storm of calculations. The fight with Vieira had been one thing, but the weight of his victory had set 1,000 unseen consequences into motion. He knew that power despises uncertainty, and what he had done, what Vieira had done by standing beside him, had shifted the balance of it in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Across from him, Vieira stood in front of the small, reinforced table, sharpening her blade with slow, deliberate strokes. She had said little since they left the throne room, but she didn't need to. The way she moved, the way her eyes flickered with the same unreadable fire from before, told him everything. She wasn't worried. She was anticipating. "You should sleep," he said, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Vieira didn't stop her movements, the slow, metallic shk of her blade against the whetstone a steady sound between them. "Sleep is for warriors who are not being hunted." Eric smirked. "That bad, huh?" She finally looked at him, setting the blade down with a soft clink. "You have embarrassed my father before his entire kingdom. You think he will simply accept that?" Eric exhaled slowly. "No." Vieira leaned forward slightly, resting her palms on the table. "Then you should be ready. They will come." He met her gaze, reading the certainty there. She knew, and she wasn't wrong. Tharos may have begrudgingly accepted the results of the arena, but there was a difference between honoring the law and respecting it. He had seen the faces of the warlords, the generals, the noble houses that had watched the duel. They would not accept this quietly. Which meant only one thing. He wasn't going to have to fight for his life once. He was going to have to fight for it every single day. A sudden knock at the heavy metal door shattered the quiet. Vieira was on her feet instantly, her blade in hand, stepping smoothly toward the door before Eric could react. He followed, his pulse steady, his mind sharpening for the confrontation he already knew was coming. The door slammed open before Vieira could reach it. A figure stood in the doorway, clad in battle armor, taller than even Vieira, eyes sharp and filled with nothing but raw contempt. General Aaras. Eric recognized him instantly. One of Tharos's most ruthless commanders, a warrior who had led the Dominion's expansion into war-torn galaxies and crushed insurrections without hesitation. His very presence sent a message. "You should not be here, human," Aaras said, voice like distant thunder. Eric didn't move. "And yet, here I am." Aaras' gaze flicked to Vieira, his expression hardening. "You shame your father, your bloodline. Do you understand the chaos you have unleashed?" Vieira tilted her head, utterly unfazed. The law was upheld. "Or have you come to dispute it?" Aaras' jaw clenched. "I have come to correct it." Before Eric could react, the general lunged. Steel met steel, the room exploding into violence in an instant. The first strike was meant to kill him. Eric barely had time to move. twisting at the last second as Aaras' blade sliced through the air where his throat had been moments before. Vieira was already moving, intercepting the next attack with a brutal counter, her blade clashing against Aaras' with a force that sent sparks flying. The room shook with impact, and Eric didn't waste a second. He surged forward, striking low, aiming for the gaps in Aaras' armor, only for the general to pivot, deflecting the attack with inhuman speed. Aaras was fast, faster than Eric had anticipated, faster than most warriors he had ever fought. And he was strong. Eric felt it when the general's backhand sent him stumbling, the sheer force of it rattling his bones. But he didn't fall. He didn't give the bastard the satisfaction. "You are nothing," Aaras snarled, shifting his blade to strike again. A mistake that should have been ended in the arena. Vieira caught the blow, her own strength meeting his in a deadlock, their weapons pressing against each other, neither willing to yield. "Then why are you here?" she shot back, her voice sharp as her blade. "If he is nothing, then why do you fear him?" The words hit their mark. Aaras' expression twisted, his golden eyes flashing with fury. He shoved Vieira back, turning his attention to Eric once more. "Because he threatens everything we are," Aaras hissed. "He is an outsider, a weakling, a human, and yet he stands in a place he does not deserve." Eric's smirk was slow, deliberate. "Then prove it." He lunged first this time, catching Aaras off guard. His blade slashed low, drawing a thin line of blood across the general's side. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. Aaras' stance shifted. The momentary opening was all Vieira needed. She moved faster than Eric had ever seen, her blade cutting through the air in a precise, ruthless arc, forcing Aaras into full retreat. She wasn't just fighting him, she was putting him in his place, and Aaras knew it. With one final snarl, the general disengaged, stepping back toward the doorway, his breathing heavy, his wound still bleeding. "You have made enemies this day, human," he spat. "Powerful ones. Do not think for a second that this is over." Eric wiped the blood from his blade and shrugged. "Good, I'd hate to be bored." Aaras' glare burned into him for another long moment before the general turned and stormed out of the room, vanishing down the corridor. Silence settled once more. Eric exhaled, rolling his shoulders, already feeling the bruises forming. He turned to Vieira, shaking his head. "So that happen often?" She smirked. "More than you'd think." He let out a tired laugh. "Fantastic." Vieira studied him for a moment, then tilted her head. "You did well." Eric raised a brow. "That your way of saying thanks?" She stepped closer, just enough for him to see the way her golden eyes burned with something deeper. Something unspoken. "I do not thank warriors for doing what they were meant to do," she murmured, "but I recognize strength when I see it." The air between them shifted. Neither of them spoke, neither moved, until Vieira finally exhaled, breaking the moment. "Rest, human," she said, turning toward the door. "The next battle is always closer than you think." And as Eric watched her walk away, he knew she wasn't just talking about war. She was talking about them. And for the first time since he had stepped into the arena, he realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something else entirely.